Hi, everyone. Welcome to the closing plenary. My name is Janet Yale. I'm president and CEO of the Arthritis Society, a national health charity. I'm also honored to serve as chair of the board of the Health Charities Coalition of Canada. I just want to start by congratulating CADTH, Brian, for an incredibly successful symposium in Halifax, notwithstanding the weather challenges, and to leave it, no pressure everybody, to our panel to do a great wrap-up for what has been just an outstanding event. As you've heard, there's been lots of discussion about affordability, accessibility, and appropriateness of medicines, the so-called 3 A's, and they've been a big part of the policy and political discourse across Canada. And the challenge is to see how those goals can complement each other rather than being seen as mutually exclusive. So I'm going to be putting a series of questions to our panelists here today, and I think we're going to have a great conversation among us all so we can go back to our day jobs with a bit more of a grasp. At the end of the day, what we're all trying to do is improve health outcomes and the lives of Canadians with a variety of health conditions. So we're going to start by asking the can we have it all question. When it comes to pharmaceuticals, can we have faster and broader access, appropriate prescribing and use, and more affordable prices all at the same time? And as the panelists address that question, we're going to think about what changes are necessary to make that possible, and of course, whether a national Pharmacare program is part of the answer, including some thinking from other jurisdictions. Those are just the small questions we're going to be thinking about for the next hour and some. We're going to have some Q&A to start with the panel, and then I really am hoping that we leave a good 15-20 minutes for questions and comments from the floor. But let me just take a minute to introduce our panels, starting beside me with Sir Andrew Dillon, who joins us from the UK's National Health Service and is here to share insights and lessons learned from his country's experiences. And he is, of course, a leader in health technology assessment, having joined the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, or NICE as it's known, as its founding chief executive in 1999. Beside him is Brian Hilberdink, who is the industry representative on our panel today. He's the current president of Novo Nordisk Canada, which is one of the world's largest biotechnology companies. He's also a board member of both Innovative Medicines Canada and Biotech Canada. Beside him is Dr. Marianne Taylor, who is going to give us a clinical perspective or clinician perspective on these issues. She's a practicing medical oncologist, has been in practice for 28 years. She's held leadership positions at the BC Cancer Agency for over a decade, where she was responsible for managing the provincial cancer drug budget. And she was also former chair of the provincial advisory group at PCODER and currently working on the drug funding sustainability project for CAPCA. And last but not least is Dr. Steve Morgan. He's here to provide us, obviously, with more of an academic perspective. He is a professor of health policy in the School of Population and Public Health at the University of British Columbia and a longtime advocate for the implementation of universal pharmacare in Canada. So I'm going to join the panelists over here and get started. Just moving over. So, can you all still hear me? Yes, great. So perhaps we can start with you, Andrew, and with the big opening question, I'm going to give each panelist a few minutes to talk about, can we have it all? And over to you to kick off our conversation.
Well, thanks. I'm going to cheat slightly.
Already?
Already, yeah. By tweaking the question a little bit, because it's pretty clear that we do get great new technologies that represent substantial incremental therapeutic benefits, and we get them at a price that health systems can afford. So it's perfectly possible for those 3 A's to be in place. The question of whether it's realistic and possible to think that all of that can be in place all of the time for all the products that we look at. I mean, theoretically, it must be possible. but it does require a number of conditions to be in place, which require all the players in the ecosystem that's involved in making decisions about adopting new technologies to get everything right. And because the chances of that happening are not strong, particularly in circumstances where health systems are being challenged by radically new technologies, and where those new technologies that are arriving in circumstances, just speaking parochially, as is the case in the UK at the moment, where the health system is under severe financial stress. I think the chances of it happening, though, are enhanced if there's really good engagement, if companies in developing products really understand how their health systems are prioritizing value, what's important to them, take the time to take advantage of the opportunities that exist in many places, including here in Canada, to find out what health systems are looking for, how they assess value, and what is going to be necessary for them to craft a value proposition that's going to be compelling, to be sensitive to the fiscal realities that health systems are under, and to think creatively about how to support the adoption of their technologies, particularly where there's significant budget impact early on. Health systems need to be clear with companies about how they assess value. They need to be flexible in the way they go about doing that. They need to be open to creative thinking about adoption in the short term and the longer term. So if those conditions are in place, then we've got the best fighting chance of getting those three A's in place, at least for the majority of the things that are coming up.
Thanks. And I'm going to come back a bit later to the issue of engagement, which is an issue that you've mentioned. But I'm going to maybe continue down the chain, if you don't mind, and give Brian a bit of an opportunity to set the stage from his perspective on the 3A's question.
Yeah, thank you for the question, and thanks for the organizers for the invitation to be part of what is a really important discussion and a very topical discussion right now. As I was introduced, I'm the president of Novo Nordisk in Canada. For those of you who aren't familiar with Novo Nordisk, it's the world's leading diabetes company. We make about half the world's supply of insulin and also innovative products, other innovative diabetes products in hemophilia, also obesity, growth disorders. And I think what's interesting and relevant for this audience is that the company actually started with a public-private partnership with the University of Toronto and Frederick Banting. Frederick Banting referred to the discovery of insulin as a great Canadian gift to share with the world and quickly looked for people who could manufacture insulin. But it wasn't just about manufacturing what they discovered in the University of Toronto. It was with a commitment that the companies would continuously innovate. And that's a commitment that August Cole, the founder of Novo Nordisk, also the person who nominated Frederick Banting and J.R.R. MacLeod for Canada's first Nobel Prize, have honored that commitment now for 95 years. And even though we don't have a cure yet for diabetes, I think it's fair to say that people's lives living with diabetes have improved dramatically thanks to innovation. I think the perspective that I can best provide on this panel is that of someone who has worked at a multinational company for many years. And I spent many years outside of Canada where I actually had a position where I would determine launch sequences for Novo Nordisk and determine which markets to invest in. So if that's a question or a topic that you would like to dig into more detail, just in terms of understanding a little more with how a pharmaceutical company makes those prioritizations, I'd be happy to go into more detail. I think it's really interesting and provocative that we talk about this question, can we have it all? Because it almost gets to the point where it sounds like we need to be making some major trade-offs, and that it becomes a very binary discussion that either we need to choose a system that's maybe like in Australia, New Zealand, that could be very restrictive to the innovative drugs that are launched, very restrictive in pricing, or we're in a situation where we have these escalating costs and healthcare systems are, of course, already incredibly stretched. I think it's a far more nuanced conversation than that. And I also think that Canada is very unique in the fact that we have this hybrid between a private market and a public market. And while we can look at other jurisdictions, like the United Kingdom as an example, for inspiration, we need a made-in-Canada solution for really what is a made-in-Canada opportunity and a made-in-Canada potential problem with individuals that fall between the cracks. We need to keep in mind from a pricing standpoint in Canada, And I'm not trying to marginalize cost of drugs because we understand that that is a considerable investment. But just to provide a little bit of perspective, because we do have a lot of patients sourcing their drugs through private insurance, the actual cost on public budgets is approximately 4% of their healthcare budgets when you take away distribution fees and pharmacy dispensing fees. Again, I'm not trying to minimize the cost or say that it's insignificant, but I think that cost should always be put into a broader perspective where we can understand holistically that the right drug for the right patient at the right time can also generate significant savings downstream. I also think that there's misconceptions about the list prices in Canada and that we have amongst the highest prices in the world. In reality, when we look at the data published by the Patent and Medicine Pricing Review Board, we can see that Canada is below the mean and right at the median, actually right together with the UK in terms of a price comparison country. On the access equation, clearly there are Canadians who struggle to pay for their drugs, and I know one of my panelists, Steve Morgan, has published a lot of data in this area suggesting that it could be as high as 8.3% of Canadians over the age of 55 struggle to pay for their medication or have some kind of adherence-related issues based on cost. There was also a report recently published by our country's most famous pollster, Nick Nanos, which indicated that it was 0.5%. Whether it's 175,000 Canadians or it's 1 million or 2 million Canadians, I think anything more than one is too many. We need to help those Canadians. But the reason why I'm mentioning some data is because I think that it is far more cost-effective, far more efficient in order to plug some of the holes to help those individuals that need the most help as opposed to a fundamental reset in our healthcare system. And I would love to change the narrative from cost control to really looking at how we can leverage Canada's unique position, having this kind of hybrid position with a private and a public market, having the heterogeneous population that we have focused in urban centers, make this the best place in the world to do clinical trials. Let's find ways that we can encourage even more investment in Canada. Currently, it's an economic footprint of over $19 billion from the innovative pharma segment. I think we can expand that dramatically and change the narrative and plug the holes in the system.
Thank you, Brian. And obviously some people who agree with you on that. I think we're going to come back to this issue of the role of public versus private in the context of Pharmacare, and also come back to this issue of the complex interplay globally with pricing and prioritization in terms of access. So hold those thoughts, and we'll come back to those in a bit. But I want to give Marianne and Steve both an opportunity to get some preliminary views on the table. So Marianne, perhaps you can give us your perspective as someone who has been in managing drug programs and a clinician yourself on how you think about these issues.
So I'd first like to thank the organizers for inviting me to the conference. Thank you very much. And I just want to explain that my experience is in cancer drugs, so my comments are on the cancer drug space. And I'm going to try and answer the question, can we have it all? And for me, it depends exactly what we're trying to have. If it's every possible drug for any cancer, then the answer is no. But if it's a sensible meeting the highest needs of patients in cancer, then I think we can have it all. And again, it depends on your definition. I think it's early days for the cancer drug system, and we've been grappling with how to do things. And I think the same thing's true of non-cancer drugs. And one of the problems is how we're structured in Canada. We're not one system, we're a bunch of systems trying to get along. But going forward, I think we're either going to have a national drug program, or we're going to have to continue to work very closely as provinces. And in the cancer drug space, I've seen a tremendous change here. We've gone from one province approving one drug and another not approving a drug to pretty cooperative work where that kind of thing doesn't happen very often anymore. I wanted to comment about the triple aims. Appropriateness, I think we're really good at the one of HTAs. I think CADTH gives us excellent reviews of cancer drugs. It outlines the appropriate population. And the provinces are really good at implementing these recommendations. And I think the physicians are using the drugs appropriately. I don't think that's a big problem in cancer. It's fairly easy to control that. But where I think we need more work, and it came up this morning in the HTM plenary session, I think we need more work on how to fit the new drug into the old system. And that's what the provinces are really struggling with. Where's it fit? Is there something we can give up to make this one fit in a little bit better into the budget, et cetera? What makes sense from a physician and patient perspective? And how do we make those choices? And there's also pressure on the system to approve drugs sooner. And I understand that. Patients and physicians want these new promising drugs as soon as they can get them. But how do we make sure that is an appropriate way to spend our funds? And how do we come back to that? We'll have to figure that out. Affordability, or I like to refer to it as sustainability. We need to control prices, and PMPRB may have some solutions to that. I think we might have to be more vocal about what our thresholds are. I think we have thresholds in Canada, at least for cancer drugs, but they're not visible and they're not transparent. And I think we might have to become transparent about that. And I think we need to pay less for drugs with uncertain evidence. That may be controversial. As far as accessibility, I think it's great. In Canada, if you've got cancer, most of the standard therapies, all the standard therapies proven, are free. You don't have to pay for them. But what I see is some disparity where some of the newer expensive drugs haven't been funded in some of the provinces, and I think it's an affordability thing. There's also some disparity around oral cancer drugs. In some provinces, they're totally covered. In other provinces, they're not, and there's co-pays and insurance things that you have to work out, or some people, I think, are even paying for them themselves. And finally, I think the process of HDA takes a long time, and that should get speeded up, especially for cancer patients, because it might mean the difference between extending their life, allowing them to do more things with the time remaining to them. So in summary, I truly believe that we can have it all by my definition, and I think it's going to require us all to work together. And I think we're making headway on working together, but I think there's always room for improvement. I think we need to keep striving for excellence.
Thank you, Marianne, and I think you've raised a couple of issues that we'll want to come back to, both around engagement and some of the disparities that you point out to regionally across the country. But Steve, I'm going to give you an opportunity to give us your perspective. You've written extensively on the issue of universal pharmacare, and so perhaps you can answer those 3A's question in the context of your overall perspective on the path forward.
Yeah, thanks. And I mean, to answer the question quickly, can we have it all? We can have some of all of it is probably the right question. And as a society, we need to figure out how to balance competing interests in the pharmaceutical space, just like in any other aspect of the healthcare system. I, first and foremost, think it's important that we as Canadians recognize that as a country, we're signatory to a number of UN declarations that make it very clear that health is a fundamental human right. And as a consequence of that, access to health care is a fundamental human right, one that Canada has done a reasonably good job at fulfilling in a non-discriminatory basis as it pertains to access to hospital care and access to medical services. We are the only high-income country with universal coverage for those services that has not done a complete job on ensuring access to necessary medicines on a non-discriminatory basis. There are now something on the order of 7 different international and national surveys that have established by Statistics Canada, the U.S. Commonwealth Fund, and even the joint Canada-U.S. Health Survey that show that Canadians do fill prescriptions often, but a good percentage of Canadians, approximately 1 in 10 who receive prescriptions, report that they choose not to fill them as prescribed because of cost. That rate of what we would call cost-related non-adherence to medicines or otherwise access barriers to medicines varies across the country in ways that we as Canadians should be ashamed of in the sense that we have forms of access that some people in some provinces get access to treatments that other people in other provinces don't. But even more embarrassing for Canada is the fact that Canadians on average experience these access barriers at rates that are between 2 and 5 times international comparators. And whether it's Australia, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, or the Netherlands that you compare to, all systems that have universal coverage for medicines in a way that is reasonably well integrated with the rest of their health insurance system, they achieve the access goal a lot better than we do. But what's interesting about integrating medicines into the healthcare system in a meaningful way is it also allows you and it incentivizes the managers and practitioners in the system to better pursue the other goals of affordability and appropriateness. And these are things that we need to be looking at very carefully. Appropriate use of medicines is essential to the access story. Those of us who have been working on access to medicines in Canada from a research perspective for many years now have never suggested that what we want is a system in this country that would exacerbate prevailing rates of inappropriate prescribing. What we've argued, and I've articulated in a couple of manuscripts, one dating back to 2009 actually with a variety of international colleagues looking at what we call the AAA framework for pharmaceutical policy. So access, appropriateness, and affordability was what we posited back in 2009 as the framework for policies. Just recently in 2016, we wrote a very specific for Canada framework on how to achieve those policies. And the thing that we really believe is important is that we as a country have to define and settle on a mission statement, if you will, or a vision statement for pharmaceutical policy. And that is the coordinated nexus of different things that different levels of government do that affect the availability, use, and ultimately outcomes from pharmaceuticals. And we took the bold initiative, I guess, from a researcher's perspective of suggesting that Canada's goal should be coordinated health and pharmaceutical policies that best achieve improvements in both the level and distribution of the health of Canadians. And we think that's fairly consistent with what governments have been recommending in Canada in commission after commission, and even it seems to be consistent with the Fit for Purpose report that Drs. Forrest and Martin recently produced concerning pan-Canadian organizations. So I think there's a lot of hope. Canada, as I started off, we're far behind international comparators on some of the key goals here, but it's not impossible to envision a change in policy, a change in framework that would allow us to get closer to these other things. And I think doing so in a concerted fashion, one that is mindful of all 3 of those goals, is critically important. Trying to pursue lower costs just for lower costs' sake is foolish. Trying to get universal insurance for medicines just for universal insurance sake is foolish. What we need to do is design a pharmaceutical strategy that, to borrow the Forrest and Martin title, a pharmaceutical strategy that is fit for purpose, fit for making Canada's healthcare system ready for the 21st century medicines that are already coming and already posing challenges for us.
Thank you so much, and it was very heartening to hear your perspective that at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is improve health outcomes, because obviously patient outcomes are the reason that we're doing this. And so in order to make sure that our systems are focused on outcomes, I wonder if who would like to comment a little bit on, from a patient engagement perspective in all of these questions. We have a lot of actors in the space, but patient groups and patient organizations don't necessarily always feel that they have a seat at the big table, so to speak. And I wonder how, if we're trying to ensure that patient outcomes are improved through whatever initiatives we drive in this Pharmacare conversation, what are your thoughts around engagement of stakeholders, and obviously including embedding that perspective of patient engagement in every part of the process? I don't know who'd like to kick it off, Marianne. I mean, obviously you've dealt with a lot of these issues.
So my experience is with CAPCAN, the drug funding sustainability, and we've been reaching out, engaging physicians on various files. And what I've been, and we just started doing it, and then we've been perfecting the process as we go along. We started out with surveys, and now for more complicated issues, we go to panels and have calls with the physicians and hear their perspectives. And what I'm surprised by is how receptive they are to the drug funding sustainability problem. We explain it to them, and they get it. It's not foreign language to them. I think a lot of them have already heard it internally in their provinces. And so I think that's what surprised me the most. I don't have any experience reaching out to patients or patient groups, but I would imagine we would do it in the same way. And I think we'd be surprised by what we heard back.
Andrew, perhaps you could comment from the experience in the UK as to the whole process of stakeholder engagement and the deliberations that you're part of.
Sure. I mean, it's now, I think, fairly well embedded in the processes that NICE operates.
Can you maybe describe for us a little bit of how that works?
Sure. I mean, there's a patient perspective right from the initial scoping work that's done before we begin the process of evaluating a new technology through membership of the advisory committees, opportunity for the organized patient advocacy movement that has an interest in the technology to engage by submitting evidence if they want to, certainly by commenting on the draft recommendations when they're published. And patient groups have that are registered for a particular topic have the right to appeal before guidance goes out into the NHS. So there's quite extensive engagement. I think if you were to ask, a selection of patient advocates who've been involved in NICE, obviously you get a range of views. Sometimes, I guess, they might feel that their carefully crafted, frequently passionately presented arguments haven't been fully taken into account. It's almost inevitable in circumstances where the outcome isn't what they're looking for. But I was thinking, just as you were talking, about a particular example of where we do involve patient groups in the business of crafting managed access agreements. And we use these when drugs are going into the new Cancer Drugs Fund in the UK, which is now an opportunity for our advisory committees to place recommendations in the context of further research that's funded by the NHS at a price agreed with the company for a fixed period of time, with clearly specified data collection framework, followed at the end of it by a further review by NICE and a decision on routine funding. And another example where we are crafting decisions for treatments for very rare conditions. So this is where there's just a handful of patients in the country, the enzyme deficiencies, where the agreements that we broker between the companies and the main commissioner are frequently informed by active engagement by the patient organization, or perhaps in some cases, one or two patient organizations, where there's a very specific, very detailed, quantifiable contribution by patient organizations. So I guess the experience would be a range, but there's certainly a serious intention on our part to ensure that there is a perspective on the outcome of our appraisals that comes very much from people who are living with a condition or speaking on behalf of people who are living with a condition. And where we can, to make sure that if there's a unique contribution to the detail of a piece of work that we're doing that can only come from patient advocates, then that's captured and taken into account in the decision.
Great, thank you. I want to move on a little bit to something, Brian, that you raised, which is this whole issue of prioritization. Obviously, the issue of pricing is an important one, and we've heard a few different perspectives on the importance or non-importance of pricing in this whole debate, and the trade-off between pricing potentially and increased access. Prices come down, perhaps we can afford to have more access. And obviously, your organization has been very involved in the whole PMPRB conversation about the potential reduction to maximum list prices and the implications of that. I wonder if you maybe could kick off that conversation in the context of this whole affordability question and maybe share with the audience how you've thought about this issue of pricing in the Canadian context and the implications in the global marketplace.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And again, we got to keep in mind.
In less than 45 minutes. I know you could go on for hours.
Okay, I saw it was 45 minutes. I was thinking I'll leave 2 minutes at the end. No, and very quickly, it's a very complicated issue. And when we look at prices in Canada, again, we got to realize that we do have prices that are right now similar to the UK, in line with a lot of different European countries. Now, the issue is if we want to extend access to certain individuals, and we know that there's certain individuals that are facing affordability issues, the question we have to ask ourselves is lowering the list price slightly, 15, 20, even 30%, is that going to make the drug more affordable for those individuals that currently are facing cost-related adherence issues? And the answer, I would say, is most likely not. What it will do, however, is create a situation where the type of rebate that we're able to provide as an innovative company to the public plans will decrease. So in an effort to try to lower list prices, it can actually transfer or increase costs to the public sector. Because the prices that we offer to the public sector, which is through the mechanism known as the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance, and then is set up in a product listing agreement, are amongst, and I can't speak on behalf of all companies, my company, they're amongst the lowest prices that are offered in the world. And the only way we're able to offer such a low price is because it's a confidential agreement, it's not a referenceable price, and we have this list price, which is kind of a fair international mean price, which can offset that low price that's offered on the public sector. So the challenge with these reforms that are being proposed by the Patent and Medicine Pricing Review Board is by lowering that list price, it's taking value out of the marketplace, it will negate the ability to offer that rebate payment. It'll also create a disincentive for innovative pharma launching in Canada first, because if suddenly we have lower prices than benchmark countries, this will become a second or third wave launch country, meaning that we will see the drugs launched in the United States, we'll see it launched in Europe, we'll see it launched in Japan and other jurisdictions around the world before it comes to Canada. And again, I don't think as a Canadian, as someone who plans to retire in this country, that's not a great development.
So I know, Steve, you're dying to jump in on this, and I will have a follow-up question that probes a little bit further on this, but Steve, I'll let you go first.
Yeah, so I think to the audience's surprise, I think we're on the same page on a couple of the lines of narrative there. One is lowering list prices of medicines in Canada is not going to address the access gaps for the uninsured and underinsured, because there's plenty of people, particularly from provinces like mine, and there's many others with income-based deductibles. You still have to spend hundreds, if not thousands of dollars on medicines before insurance kicks in. Lowering your list price on those costs by 20, 30% still means you're still paying hundreds, if not thousands, and that is a significant barrier, not to mention also essentially a significant tax on poor health. So lowering list prices is not necessarily going to help us with access. And I agree, and I say this having, I sit on I think it's called Technical Expert Advisory Committee, or some very WHO-esque sounding group for the World Health Organization's Fair Pricing Forum. And I've had the good fortune of talking with absolutely brilliant people around the world who are struggling with similar affordability issues in terms of the prices of medicines. And it's become ever so clear to me that list prices, as many of you know, it's a shell game. It's not the transaction price in any of the health systems we compare to, anyhow. And if lowering Canada's transaction prices does put manufacturers in a bind that makes them feel uncomfortable about launching here, our regulatory frameworks may need to have an option for them to get out and have a list price that is above what appears to be a limit, because the negotiated rebates get them below thresholds. As I understand it, and there are PMPRB employees in the room, as I understand the working papers and the draft consultation documents is that maybe there's room for that. Maybe there's room for saying, Canada's focus in terms of regulatory modernization shouldn't be so much on list as much as it should be on net price to the health system or to our society. And on those grounds, I would be in full agreement. I think that Canada, we need to have better procurement strategies. We need to give manufacturers more volume when a PCPA deal is signed, not just one-off at a time, provinces taking up the deal, but across the board, if it's right for coverage in one jurisdiction or for some Canadians, it should be right for coverage for all. So I think there are ways of working with the PMPRB's modernization that would still protect the system, but not unduly harm the industry in the Canadian context.
So if I could follow up on that, I think you've both spoken very eloquently to the difference between what I would call retail and wholesale. In other words, the maximum list price, as we all know from many consumer contexts, nobody pays it. Fair enough. But the difficulty, as you pointed out, Brian, is they're secret. So for organizations and stakeholders that aren't at the table when those discussions are happening, it's not transparent, there's no disclosure, and it's very hard then to know what is going on, whether there is fairness across jurisdictions, because each of these, I guess through PCPA, they're starting to be harmonized across provinces. But it makes it very hard then when we see, for example, a PMPRB proposal to comment meaningfully, because we know what's being proposed at the maximum list price level, but there's no transparency as to what happens after that, certainly in the public plans, let alone what that means for the private plans. So coming back to this issue of, I don't disagree that perhaps the PMPRB maximum list price is almost a red herring in this conversation around affordability, but how do we get into these issues in a way that, that allows useful stakeholder consultations if in fact the real pricing nobody knows except those who are at the table? Is that, I don't know if that's a fair question, but I'm asking it anyway.
It's a completely fair question, and I agree. It's very difficult, even when you're comparing prices in different countries, it's very difficult to understand what is the real price. Are you looking at a kind of ex-factory price, a pharmacy price, is there rebates, clawback mechanisms? If we had a country of 35 million people where we had no healthcare system and we're inventing a healthcare system, we would probably come up with something different than what currently exists in Canada. The challenge is the way we're set up right now with a lot of the costs being borne by the private sector. For us to now move to kind of a harmonized system, I'm just not sure who would pay for that and how we would transfer all the costs to the public sector. Because again, the only way that we're able to offer these very deep discounts and the rebates is because they're confidential. If they weren't confidential, if they were referenceable, we wouldn't be able to offer them. And that creates a little bit of the tension.
So Andrew, you've just listened to this conversation about the difference between maximum list price and prices actually paid and the implications of that in a global marketplace. Do you have a perspective on this pricing issue, given the UK experience, and any advice you'd give us in Canada?
There's a bit of similarity in the debate that goes on in the UK, where there's a perfectly reasonable argument that, particularly in a publicly funded system, so using public money, anybody who has an interest in how that money is spent ought to be able to know what price is being paid by the things that are being bought with that money, whether that's in healthcare or any other branch of the public sector. And I think it's fine, except that we don't exist in a bubble. Our relationship with just as here in Canada, with the life sciences industry isn't just in the UK or just in Canada, it's a global marketplace. And in those circumstances, I think we just have to accept that sometimes we have to exist with the reality of compromising on our ideal position in relation to price transparency and what's necessary in order to maximize what we can get from the investment that we've got in health in the UK. And it must be the same in other countries too. In a way, those who aren't directly involved in the discussions, as you say, are not around the table, so they can't actually see the data, aren't part of a confidentiality club or some other arrangement that allows them to see the price. Probably in some circumstances have to accept that they're going to have to trust the process that's going on, providing they can see how, in general terms, how that process is working, what kind of arrangements and agreements can be put in place, what are the circumstances in which companies can agree a price that's confidential, then I guess probably they've got to allow that process to run its course. And in those circumstances where we have a confidential agreement, trust that the system has put in place the best efforts it can. The best effort is made, the best effort it can to get the best price.
So trust is a huge issue in these processes, even if the outcome of the process or the. So I want to get into one more area before I open the floor to questions, and that has to do with new therapies and innovation. Because one of the things we've been talking about a little bit is how do we ensure that people, Steve, as you put it, have a human right around non-discriminatory access to therapies. But as we know, certainly in the case of arthritis, with new advances, we're going to see a lot more treat to target, a lot more precision medicine, a lot more emerging therapies that serve potentially smaller and smaller subsets of the population, let alone some of the issues around rare diseases that have been the subject of certain conversations. I wonder if I could ask you to comment on how you see, in the context of this Pharmacare affordability access conversation, how do we deal with the likely evolution of therapies, which there may be lots that have mass market distribution, but more and more that have smaller and smaller markets, and how do we deal with access and affordability issues around those? Maybe I'll start at that end, Steve, and move up and see who would like to comment.
Yeah, so it's a wonderful question. I think that there's a lot of understandable uncertainty around, well, what if we have a national formulary or some system of universal coverage in Canada, what's in there? And the answer to that is a bit Romano-esque, is that whatever will be in there, there will be as much in there as you want to put in there in terms of what resources you wish to dedicate to the system. And that's an important question. This weekend at the Liberal Party convention, they're voting on a motion concerning universal access to medicines in Canada, and that motion is crystal clear about designing an evidence-based national formulary that would be brought into the Canada Health Act. So essentially means universal single-payer coverage for a list of medicines that all Canadians should have access to under the Canada Health Act. How big is that list, and where should it be? That's going to be important. I think that list can be large, it can be comprehensive, and I would argue that it should, because all Canadians, no matter what disease they have this right to have their health needs fulfilled. I also think the system needs to build into it the institutional capacity to ensure that the medicines are being used appropriately, that we're following up on patient outcomes, and that we're getting value for money for the investments we're making, including some of the more innovative pay-for-performance contracts with manufacturers to address questions of uncertainty, questions of indication creep, et cetera. All of that can be done, and I think Canada actually is a world leader in many of the elements that are necessary to do that. We just need the institutional capacity, and that may take, frankly, because of the way that we tend to fumble along, not so eloquently sometimes in Canada, or elegantly, it may take a big push. We may need something of a more transformative change to some of our institutions, thinking about fit for purpose recommendations, and to some of how we go about determining what's in, what's out. In those, if pushed in the right way, I think we can ready ourselves to be prepared so that Canadians really do have an equitable chance and equitable access to what they need.
So certainly the $64,000 question may be what's on that list of medicines, and we've seen announcements from various parties, even in the context of the Ontario election, as to what's in and what's out, which of course is very controversial.
But just to be clear too, though, at the provincial level, the provinces are waiting for Ottawa to signal where it's headed. So if you took the PBO's report on a national pharmacare program based on the Quebec formulary, essentially, if you read between the lines, that PBO report would suggest that if the feds put up $7 billion a year, the private sector would save $11 billion a year, so they get more than the 7 back. And you could, at a national level, cover the Quebec formulary, which is quite wide. So provinces aren't ready to say we want everyone in Canada to have Quebec's formulary, because they're waiting, frankly and understandably, to find out how big is that federal check?
How big? Brian, did you want to comment?
Yeah,
I think Marianne wants to comment as well.
You go ahead, Brian.
Well, I just wanted to pick up on one comment that Steve made, which I think is a very good one, and that is this pay-for-performance type model. I'm personally a big advocate of put more onus on the innovative companies to show that we can deliver the outcomes that we show in clinical trials in a real-world evidence setting. And I think one of the ways that you can expand formularies, ensure that there is lots of choice, is decide what are we willing to pay for outcomes. And again, I'll go on the record to say that I want to be in the business of selling outcomes, not individual drugs. And I think that that's one mechanism that we can definitely agree on. And I think that Canada is quickly evolving to being a center of excellence when it comes to digital health, when it comes to artificial intelligence. And let's utilize big data and let's make this a center of excellence for doing that type of contracting. I think, again, I think that we're in a perfect position in Canada to take advantage of our current healthcare setup and system to evolve that's something that could be the envy of the world and not just, again, continually look at it as being problematic.
So, and just if I can make one tiny comment on that before I go to Marianne, I think one of the things, if we're talking about an outcome-based approach, we have to make sure that the data collection and the patient outcomes are actually measured, evaluated, and recorded in a way that perhaps we haven't focused on to date. I think we tend in the healthcare system to focus more on outputs than outcomes. And so if we start moving in that direction, I think being able to capture and measure those patient outcomes is going to be critical. Marianne, did you want to comment on this?
I think the only comment I'd have is figuring out what goes in that bucket of what's covered is something that we'd all have to do together, and there'd have to be dialogue between patients, the public, and people in the healthcare system to figure out what exactly it is we want as Canadians. And then once that's figured out, then you can start putting stuff in, and you're going to have a set budget. You have to stick with it.
And Andrew, in the UK, how has that list and the changes to the list been managed in terms of what is and isn't covered?
There isn't a list as such.
Welcome to the UK.
The English NHS, once a drug or a technology goes through its regulatory process, it becomes available for use in the system.
And paid for?
Well, that depends on a number of things. It depends on to some extent, if NICE has reviewed it, it will depend on the outcome of an appraisal by NICE, but we don't look at everything. I mean, maybe 60% of new drug licenses and a much, much smaller percentage of medical device and diagnostics. So everything else takes its chances in the system. Sorry, I apologize for the pinging.
I was wondering if it was, I was looking to see if it was my phone, but
no, it's
you're
me,
the culprit.
It's me. So there are lots of other influences. The main national commissioner sometimes takes a view on these technologies and will send a signal. Otherwise, it's for the 100 or so local commissioning systems working with their providers to make decisions. So for the industry, it can be quite a confusing and challenging picture. They don't have a single process, a single list that's created, and they're either on or they're off, and if they're on, that's great, and if they're off, it's terrible. It's not as binary as that. It's a much more nuanced picture in the UK, and that's likely to continue to be the case. It's part of, and it's an interesting thing, it's part of the sort of kind of unwritten deal between the government with its stewardship responsibility for the NHS as a universal healthcare system and all of us who use it, that basically we think, well, if we're ill, the government will put in place something that will help us, whatever is necessary in order to fix us. We all know that's not quite the case, that there are inevitably some limitations on it. But the way those limitations are put in place is a result of a whole array of sometimes quite invisible and sometimes, as in the case of NICE, very visible and very public processes that sort of set the boundaries around what that universal healthcare offer is.
Right. I have lots more questions, but I just wanted to know, are there questions from the floor? Do people, hands up? Louise, I am not surprised you would like to do that. I'm going to ask if, when people do have questions, if they could keep them brief.
I shall.
Thank
I have
you.
it written down so I can.
Oh, lovely. Thank you.
Oh, you have to hold the mic? Okay. Louise Binder, Save Your Skin Foundation, woman living with HIV for somewhere between 25 and 30 years. My question is to Professor Morgan. You've given opinions in the press recently and as late as March 25th of this year in the Globe and Mail that suggest that most patient groups are in a conflict of interest because of the funding they received. I'd appreciate it if you could elucidate specifically the names of those groups and what it is that you perceive that we are doing that is for the benefit of industry and contrary to the best interests of patients.
Yeah, I'd be happy to chat with you later. I don't know the particular article that you're referencing. I get asked questions by the media all the time. I'll chat with you, happy to chat with you about that later.
I think, Louise, there was a panel discussion yesterday around the issue of conflict of interest and whether or not different organizations should or shouldn't take funding from particular sources. I think maybe we'll let Steve address that with you separately. Other comments or questions from the floor? It's a quiet bunch. I guess I'll just keep going with mine. One of the things, Steve, that you mentioned briefly was the issue of the Fit for Purpose report that just came out that led a review of the 8 pan-Canadian health organizations in Canada. And it's a very lengthy report with a lot of recommendations in it. And the various options that they've proposed are, it's a bit of a chess game to try and figure out how they match together, but it's a little bit of form follows function approach as I understood it, in the sense that depending on what we prioritize in terms of the functions that we want our health organizations to perform, then the form and how we merge them, collapse them, or whatever might change. So I wonder if you could give your perspective on, of course, CADTH would not be changed no matter what, but just if you could share with the audience some of your thoughts about the options and what you think of some of those choices that they've articulated.
So, and if, for those of you who haven't read it yet, and I suspect only a handful of you have had the time to read all 188 pages of it, it's a really good report. The authors have done an excellent job explaining how sort of the governance and management of Canada's healthcare system is complex and unique, probably, amongst comparable nations, and that despite all of the good intentions of everyone working in the system is flawed in ways that are an accident of history. The way that our healthcare system is organized, managed, and governed is a form of incrementalism, developed as a form of incrementalism over time. And the pan-Canadian healthcare organizations or health organizations are similarly things that developed over time to address particular needs at particular moments. And what P.G. Forrest and Danielle Martin did is to try to look at the suite of organizations and envision a future. And it was an interesting report insofar as they've given a menu of options that range from a form of incrementalism that would narrow the scope and focus CADTH in certain ways and move some of what I think is broader health technology management platform or portfolio into a new Health Quality Canada organization that would do a number of functions that we would expect of CADTH and the Canadian Foundation for Health Innovation and a number of others, rolled up into a new organization that would work with provincial partners. And CADTH and other agencies like it would have a slightly more narrow focus. They range in their recommendations, though, from something incremental such as that to something totally transformative, a couple of strategies around addressing health disparities and health inequities in Canada through radical transformations of those organizations, or to fulfill the promise of the Naylor report, the innovation the sort of report on healthcare innovation in Canada, to focus our pan-Canadian organizations around the theme of health innovation. I think that it's likely because governments tend to like to go with the comfort of incrementalism rather than deal with the institutional and perhaps even interest group related backlash of radical transformation, that it is likely that we'll see something akin to their option one, which will see some organizations eventually grandfathered or closed, and things like the Canadian Partnership Against Cancer having its current mandate come to a close, and resources dedicated to the provincial network organizations around cancer agencies, et cetera. I think there's a lot of promise. I would encourage people to read this, because what they did in terms of challenging government to articulate the vision, the 21st century vision for healthcare in Canada, is a noble accountability challenge for policymakers, particularly at the federal level in this federation. What role should the federal government play? How ambitious will they be? And how can they make that work in the complexities of our federation? In light of historical precedent and the complexities of the federation, I expect probably something akin to their option one, which is incremental reform with a greater focus on quality. As it relates to medicines, that will be a greater focus on a prescribing appropriateness and ensuring that we leverage the many initiatives that are going on at a regional level in Canada, but making sure that we're leveraging that by really scaling up the cultural change that's required to diffuse innovation. And I think that was another point which I wanted to make, which is very well articulated in their report, is that a lot of the transformation that Canada needs to achieve if we're going to actually transform the system is not just scaling up small innovations. It's actually changing cultures and changing institutions in terms of norms and behaviors and expectations such that innovations can scale up more readily.
Thank you. Does anyone else read it or care to opine on that report?
I've read it.
You have, in the context of the cancer issue in particular, I didn't know if you had.
I don't understand the organizations well enough
Fair
to really comment. But I agree with Steve that likely the solution one will be the choice, just because it's the easier one. Less controversial.
Controversial.
Yeah.
And before, I'm going to give each of the panelists a chance to leave you with one key message. But before I do that, I would be remiss, given that you mentioned the Liberal Convention that's coming and the federal announcement of a Pharmacare Advisory Council led by the former Minister of Health for Ontario, Eric Hoskins, if I didn't ask anyone who would like to speculate either on what he's likely to find. We'd certainly suspect that whatever he comes up with may well be the foundation for the next federal election, and that is going to be coming, or any advice you'd like to give Minister Hoskins as he thinks about how to approach his work. Brian, do you have any thoughts or advice on what might...
I guess the initial advice is to involve as many stakeholders as possible, and that this should not be done in isolation or in relatively small groups. There's all kinds of conflicting data in terms of trying to understand and analyze what the challenge is. Let's make sure that we get a good handle on that. Speaking on behalf of the innovative pharmaceutical industry, I think that we are far more of the solution than the problem, and I think we should be at the table to help point out some of the measures that have even been put in place in other markets around the world. And back to the comment that you raised about patient associations. Let's make sure that we're consulting with the patient groups. We always look at data in aggregate, and we make certain decisions based on what the mean looks like, but we also know that patients aren't always the mean. There's a lot of variation, and making sure that patients have choice, that clinicians have choice, is going to be increasingly important. So the consultation process, I think, is going to be absolutely key to make sure that we're working with the right assumptions to therefore come to the right conclusion.
And certainly as an organization, I think a lot of the patient organizations have already made it clear that the Advisory Council should have patient representation at the most senior levels, let alone being involved in all stages of the process. Marianne, anything you'd like to contribute?
No, I think that's good comment from Brian. I think all stakeholders need to be involved in this. And I mean, the other thing I'd like to see, and I'm sure patients want to see it as well, as a practicing physician, I sure don't want to be in a setting where it's very tight box and I can't move. Like the patient has one little thing that doesn't meet the eligibility criteria and that's it, you can't use the drug. Because that takes away all our flexibility. So that would be one thing I'd worry about if something's controlled in Ottawa and I'm way out in BC. That would worry me.
Well, I guess as a practicing clinician, you'd want to make sure as well that the clinician perspective is embedded in the council deliberations. Steve, anything you'd like to add?
I think it's going to be a couple of things we will have to see in the coming days now. We'll have to see the standing committee report from the Commons Standing Committee on Health, what they are recommending in their report.
Which is expected, I think, this week.
Yeah, it was supposed to be this morning or this afternoon, and it's now tomorrow owing to travel. The weather, the storm got to the chair of that committee who could not be at Parliament this morning. That report is due out tomorrow. We've not seen it, but we know the title is called Pharmacare Now. So it's probably going to recommend. It's probably going to recommend something. They've heard from 99 witnesses and had 30 submissions from stakeholder groups in the process. So that's fairly consultative. We're going to see what happens at the Liberal Party convention in terms of the membership of the party and whether or not they support the principle of adding medicines to Canadian Medicare. And then from there, I think Hoskins has to figure out which track to go down in terms of figuring out the logistics. And for those of you who have seen the standing orders on this council, if I remember correctly, there's a chair and a co-chair to be named and 3 other members. The council itself looks like it'll be very small, nimble, probably senior, august individuals with significant credibility in government and health from across the country, representative of the affected populations. And then there will be advisory committees, it appears. And they specifically name advisory committees of patients and public interest. They name stakeholder advisory committees from industry. They name research advisory committees. So that it is likely that they will have input into their deliberations through some kind of committee structure as yet to be determined, and that will be very important. And at the end of the day, I don't know how closely Hoskins is working with the Prime Minister's office, but you can only go so far in discussing Pharmacare without knowing how much the federal government is willing to put on the table. And I suspect, knowing Eric Hoskins, having been a Minister of Health for Ontario, and knowing the scale of investment we're talking about, he'll probably be getting a feel for that midway through their deliberations. And to be clear, these deliberations are going to have to occur on an incredibly tight timeline. The argument essentially was that they were to have a report for consideration by the finance minister for a possible inclusion in a 2019 budget, which would probably be future spending in, say, 2020 or 2021. But to get into the 2019 budget, they need to be finished by November. That's a tight timeline.
That is very tight. Let's hope that that doesn't come at the expense of consultation, for sure. And Andrew, as we start thinking about this Pharmacare debate, any advice you'd like to give us from the UK experience?
Just make it as complicated as possible.
I think we're really good at that.
More fun
We're
that way.
very good at that. I was hoping the other kind of advice. Keep it simple, right?
Well, that's what human beings do. We just make it complicated. The reality is, and it's complicated because we have competing ambitions.
Right.
And those competing ambitions operate in an environment that isn't going to allow any of those ambitions individually, and almost certainly not collectively, to be fully realized. So any debate about the enhancement of an existing healthcare system, I think, has to, including access to life sciences products, has to exist in that context. And although the UK system is different, and the things that influence and drive the debate that's going on at the moment in the UK, it's every bit as complicated and difficult as the discussions that you're having here. It's always such a pleasure to come along and listen to some other family's grief. So it's very therapeutic. You should come over to the UK. You'll feel so much better about things that are going on here.
Next time. Okay, so before we wrap up, I'm going to ask each panelist to give one key message, takeaway, piece of advice that you would like to share with the audience based on today's conversation. And you have exactly 1 minute, and I'm going to gong you if you go over. So, Steve, starting with you, 1 minute, and I'm working my way back.
Yeah, well, I guess I'll go back to our recent paper on a national pharmaceutical strategy, which articulates that Canada actually needs a strategy. We need a vision. We need definable objectives that will kind of surround a constellation of different areas of policy in this domain. And we need commitment by multiple levels of government to work towards those objectives that ultimately meet that vision. I'd encourage you all to read, download, and importantly, cite my work in that area. That would be very helpful.
Shameless self-promotion is okay in the 1 minute you have. Marianne.
So I'll speak about the cancer drug system, and I'd like to see us moving from HTA to more of a management plan with balancing off everything, and because things are going to have to come out. We can't keep piling on all these expensive drugs. So that's what I'd like to see, and I found it quite hopeful at this conference to hear that there was movement in that direction.
Thank you. Brian?
I think it's always important to ensure that Canada is put into a global context, that we continue to be this country where innovative drugs are launched in line with other countries that we would consider comparable. And then within Canada, I think cost has to be put into also some context and not just looked at in isolation on something that we want to control, but how can we work more holistically? How do we take advantage of Canada as a great place for innovation? I think that this is a brilliant opportunity that we have right now to recreate something, attract more investment to Canada, use our innovation to make sure that we cover these gaps and ultimately drive better outcomes.
Last word. Andrew.
Well, I think engagement is key. The more people are invested in a decision, the more likely it is that you're going to reach something that works for the healthcare system. So in the context of what we've been talking about, it means companies, it means patient organizations, it means people who've got responsibility for the money and other decision makers who are involved. And they need to have a safe space in which they can engage to talk about their competing ambitions, a space that's equipped to do its best to enable those competing ambitions to be reconciled. I think those two things together are so important. They're very difficult to create, but if we can do that, then regardless of the complexities surround all that, we've got the best chance of getting a good outcome.
Great. Well, I just thought I would take a minute on behalf of all of you to thank the panelists for doing a terrific job of articulating some of the challenges, the issues that we face as we confront the issue of access, affordability in a context of a national pharmacare strategy going forward. And I do think the one area of consensus that you summed up so nicely is the need for the constant conversation, dialogue, and engagement at all levels for us to have a chance of success. So let's give them all a great round of applause. Thank you all so much.